In the quiet corners of history, some photographs hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. What starts as a simple restoration project can unveil truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. This is the story of one such photograph taken on a crisp autumn morning in 1909, and the chilling discovery that would haunt everyone who encountered it. If you're ready to dive into stories that blur the line between history and mystery, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what we uncover next in our collection of haunting historical tales. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Salem, Massachusetts, as Margaret Wheeler carefully unlocked the heavy oak door of the Historical Society's archive building. At 62, she had spent the better part of 3 decades preserving the town's photographic heritage, but nothing could have prepared her for what she would discover on this particular October morning in 2019. Margaret's weathered hands moved with practiced precision as she sorted through the latest donation, a dusty cardboard box left anonymously on the Society's doorstep the previous evening. The accompanying note was brief and written in shaky handwriting. "Found these in my grandmother's attic. Thought they belonged with you folks. A friend." Inside the box, beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, lay dozens of glass plate negatives and faded photographs spanning the early 1900s. Margaret's trained eye immediately recognized the quality of the work. These weren't amateur snapshots, but the careful compositions of a skilled photographer. Each image captured a moment in Salem's past, with startling clarity. Children playing in Washington Square, merchants hawking their wares at the weekly market. Families posed stiffly in their Sunday best. But it was the photograph at the bottom of the collection that made Margaret pause. The black and white image showed a street scene from what appeared to be 1909 based on the clothing and architecture visible in the frame. In the foreground, a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, stood near a low iron fence. His face was turned toward the camera, and his small hand was raised in what appeared to be a cheerful wave. Behind him, the busy street teemed with horse-drawn carriages, well-dressed pedestrians, and the bustling energy of a thriving New England town. What struck Margaret wasn't just the quality of the photograph, but something indefinable about the boy's expression. Despite the wave, there was something in his eyes, a depth of sadness that seemed incongruous with his youthful gesture. The photograph's edges were severely damaged, with water stains and tears obscuring several areas of the image. If this gem was to be preserved for future generations, it would need the expertise of a professional restoration artist. Margaret spent the remainder of her morning researching the photograph's origins. The architectural details in the background were consistent with Salem's Federal Street District as it appeared in the early 20th century. The boy's clothing, knickers, a white cotton shirt, and leather shoes matched the fashion of affluent families from that era. But despite her extensive knowledge of Salem's photographic records, she could find no immediate match for either the photographer's style or the specific location captured in the frame. That afternoon, Margaret placed a call to Dr. James Chen, a renowned photographic restoration specialist based in Boston. Dr. Chen had worked with the Historical Society on several occasions, most notably on a collection of Civil War-era daguerreotypes that had been thought irretrievably damaged. His combination of traditional restoration techniques and cutting-edge digital technology had saved countless historical images from being lost forever. "Margaret, it's always a pleasure to hear from you." Dr. Chen's warm voice came through the phone. "What treasure have you discovered this time?" Margaret described the photograph in detail, emphasizing both its potential historical significance and the extent of the damage. "James, there's something about this image that I can't shake. The boy in the photograph. There's something haunting about his expression. I have a feeling this picture has a story to tell. But we'll need your magic touch to reveal it fully." Dr. Chen agreed to take on the project, intrigued by Margaret's description and her obvious emotional connection to the photograph. "Send it over with your usual care, and I'll begin work immediately. You know how these old photographs can surprise us once we start peeling back the layers of time and damage." 3 days later, the carefully packaged photograph arrived at Dr. Chen's state-of-the-art restoration laboratory in Boston's historic Back Bay. The lab occupied the top floor of a converted 19th-century brownstone, its large windows providing the natural light essential for delicate photographic work. Dr. Chen's workspace was a fascinating blend of old and new antique magnifying glasses and traditional chemical baths. Shared space with high-resolution scanners and sophisticated computer monitors, Dr. Chen began his examination of the photograph under a powerful magnifying lens, documenting every detail of the damage and making notes about his restoration strategy. The water damage was extensive but not insurmountable. He had worked with far worse. The tears along the edges would require careful reconstruction, and the fading in several areas would need digital enhancement to restore the original contrast and detail. As he worked, Dr. Chen found himself drawn to the same element that had captivated Margaret, the young boy's expression. Even in the damaged state of the photograph, there was something compelling about the child's gaze. His technical eye noted the superior quality of the original image. This photographer had clearly been a master of their craft, capturing not just a moment in time, but the emotional essence of their subject. The restoration process began with careful cleaning and stabilization of the original photograph. Dr. Chen used specialized solvents to remove decades of accumulated grime and carefully flattened areas where the paper had curled or warped. Once the physical restoration was complete, he moved to the digital phase of the process. Using a high-resolution scanner capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye, Dr. Chen created a digital master file of the photograph. The scanning process revealed layers of information hidden beneath the surface damage. Faint details that had been obscured by stains and tears began to emerge with startling clarity. It was during the digital enhancement phase that Dr. Chen first noticed something unusual as he adjusted the contrast and brightness levels to restore the original tonal range of the photograph. Additional details began to appear throughout the image. The background, which had seemed relatively straightforward during his initial examination, revealed a complexity that hadn't been immediately apparent. Dr. Chen worked methodically section by section, bringing new life to the century-old image. The boy's face emerged with remarkable clarity, his features delicate and aristocratic, his clothing expensive and well-tailored. The wave that had initially appeared so innocent and cheerful now seemed more complex under closer examination. There was a deliberate quality to the gesture, as if the boy was waving not at the photographer, but at someone or something specific. As Dr. Chen continued his painstaking work, enhancing shadows and restoring details that had been lost to time and damage, the photograph began to tell a richer story. The street scene behind the boy came alive with activity. He could now clearly distinguish individual faces in the crowd, read signs on storefronts, and make out the intricate details of the horse-drawn carriages that filled the busy thoroughfare. But it was in the final phase of restoration, as Dr. Chen worked to enhance the most severely damaged areas of the photograph, that he made a discovery that would haunt him for weeks to come. Using advanced digital reconstruction techniques, he was able to restore a section of the image that had been completely obscured by water damage. An area just behind and to the left of the young boy, the enhanced detail revealed something that made Dr. Chen's blood run cold. There, partially hidden behind the wrought-iron fence and barely visible even in the restored image, was the figure of a man. But this wasn't just any man. His clothing was torn and disheveled, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed. Most disturbing of all, the man appeared to be reaching toward the boy, his outstretched hand just inches from the child's shoulder. Dr. Chen stared at the screen for several long minutes, his professional composure shaken. In all his years of restoration work, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The figure wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It was clearly a human being captured by the camera in what appeared to be a moment of desperate reaching. But there was something else, something that made the discovery even more unsettling. The man's clothing, while torn and dirty, appeared to be from a different era entirely. While the boy and the other figures in the photograph were dressed in the fashions of 1909, the reaching man's garments seemed to belong to an earlier period, perhaps the 1872nd or 1882nd, based on the cut of his jacket and the style of his trousers. Dr. Chen immediately called Margaret to report his findings. "Margaret, I need you to sit down," he began, his usually steady voice betraying his agitation. "I've completed the restoration, and while the results are remarkable, there's something in this photograph that I think you need to see before I send it back." Margaret could hear the tension in Dr. Chen's voice. "James, what is it? What did you find?" There's a figure in the photograph that wasn't clearly visible before the restoration. A man reaching toward the boy, but Margaret, his clothing, it doesn't match the time period of the rest of the photograph. It's as if he's from a different era entirely. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Are you certain it's not just a trick of the restoration process? Sometimes digital enhancement can create false images. I've triple-checked everything, Dr. Chen replied. This figure was there in the original photograph. The damage just made it impossible to see clearly. Whatever this is, it was captured by the camera in 1909. That evening, Dr. Chen uploaded the enhanced image to a secure server and sent Margaret the access credentials. Despite his professional experience with historical photographs, he found himself reluctant to look at the image again. There was something profoundly unsettling about the reaching figure, something that went beyond simple historical curiosity. Margaret accessed the file from her home computer, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. When the image loaded on her screen, she gasped audibly. The restoration was indeed remarkable. The photograph now revealed details that brought the street scene to vivid life. But it was the partially hidden figure behind the fence that made her hands tremble as she adjusted her reading glasses for a closer look. The reaching man's face, while gaunt and hollow, was clearly visible in the enhanced image. His eyes held a desperate intensity, and his mouth was open, as if he were calling out to someone. Most disturbing of all, his gaze wasn't directed at the camera or at the bustling street scene. He was looking directly at the young boy with an expression that seemed to combine longing, desperation, and something that looked very much like recognition. Margaret spent hours studying the photograph, using her computer's zoom function to examine every detail of the mysterious figure. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that this wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity or photographic anomaly. There was something deliberate about the man's positioning, something intentional about his reaching gesture. Unable to shake her growing unease, Margaret decided to delve into Salem's historical records, searching for any connection between the boy in the photograph and the mysterious reaching figure. She began with the most obvious starting point: missing persons reports and unusual incidents from 1909 and the surrounding years. Salem's newspaper archives, meticulously preserved in the Historical Society's collections, yielded several intriguing leads. The Salem Evening News from October 1909 contained several reports of strange occurrences around the Federal Street area. Witnesses reported seeing figures in outdated clothing wandering the streets, and several residents complained of feeling watched or followed during their daily activities. But it was an article from the Salem Gazette, dated the 15th of November, 1909, that made Margaret's blood run cold. The headline read, "Young Timothy Whitmore still missing after 2 weeks." The accompanying story described the disappearance of 8-year-old Timothy Whitmore, son of prominent Salem merchant Charles Whitmore. The boy had last been seen playing near the wrought iron fence on Federal Street, wearing his Sunday clothes and waving to passers-by. The description of the missing boy matched perfectly with the child in the photograph. More disturbing still, the newspaper article included a small sketch of Timothy drawn from his parents' description. The resemblance to the boy in the restored photograph was unmistakable. Margaret's hands shook as she continued reading. Timothy Whitmore had never been found, despite an extensive search involving local police, volunteers, and even detectives brought in from Boston. The case had remained open for months before eventually being classified as an unsolved disappearance. The boy's parents, devastated by the loss, had eventually moved away from Salem, unable to bear the constant reminders of their missing son. But the most chilling detail came in the article's final paragraph. Several witnesses reported seeing young Timothy on the morning of his disappearance, apparently waving and calling out to someone near the Federal Street fence. However, no one could identify the person or persons to whom the boy appeared to be responding. Margaret realized with growing horror that she might be looking at the last photograph ever taken of Timothy Whitmore, an image captured moments before his mysterious disappearance. But that raised an even more disturbing question. Who or what was the reaching figure, and what role had it played in the boy's fate? Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret expanded her research to include earlier periods in Salem's history. She searched through death records, missing persons reports, and newspaper accounts from the 1872nd and 1882nd focusing on incidents that might explain the presence of a man in outdated clothing. Her persistence paid off when she discovered a series of articles from the Salem Register published in September 1878. The headlines told a tragic story. Mill worker dies in tragic accident. Thomas Hartwell crushed by machinery, and widow Hartwell seeks answers in husband's death. The articles described the death of Thomas Hartwell, a 4-year-old worker at one of Salem's textile mills. Hartwell had been killed when a mechanical loom malfunctioned, crushing him beneath its massive frame. The accident had been ruled the result of equipment failure, but Hartwell's widow had insisted that her husband had been deliberately targeted by mill management due to his efforts to organize workers for better safety conditions. What made Margaret's discovery particularly relevant was the detailed description of Thomas Hartwell provided by his widow in her plea for a more thorough investigation. Mrs. Hartwell had described her husband as tall and lean with hollow cheeks and intense dark eyes. She had also mentioned that Thomas had a distinctive way of reaching out to people when he spoke to them, a gesture he had developed during his years of trying to rally fellow workers to his cause. The physical description matched the reaching figure in the photograph with unsettling accuracy. But more disturbing still was the location of Thomas Hartwell's final workplace, the Whitmore Textile Mill, owned and operated by the family of Charles Whitmore, Timothy's father. Margaret's research revealed a complex web of connections spanning more than 3 decades. Thomas Hartwell had died fighting for worker safety at a mill owned by the Whitmore family. 31 years later, the Whitmore family's young son had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, apparently responding to someone or something that other witnesses couldn't see. The implications were staggering, but Margaret knew she needed more evidence before she could draw any definitive conclusions. She decided to research the specific location where the photograph had been taken, hoping to find additional clues about what might have transpired on that autumn day in 1909. Salem's city planning records revealed that the row iron fence visible in the photograph had been erected in 1885, 7 years after Thomas Hartwell's death. The fence had been commissioned by Charles Whitmore as part of a beautification project intended to improve the appearance of Federal Street, the same street that housed several of his business properties. More intriguingly, Margaret discovered that the land on which the fence stood had previously been the site of a small boarding house that had catered primarily to mill workers and their families. The boarding house had been demolished in 1884 to make way for Whitmore's improvements to the area. According to the records, Thomas Hartwell and his wife had lived in that boarding house during their brief marriage. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a coherent, if deeply unsettling, picture. Thomas Hartwell had lived and died in the shadow of the Whitmore family's industrial empire. Decades later, young Timothy Whitmore had vanished while apparently responding to someone near the very spot where Hartwell's former home had stood. Margaret contacted Dr. Chen to share her discoveries, hoping that his scientific perspective might provide additional insights into what they had uncovered. James, I found connections that go back more than 30 years. This photograph may have captured something far more significant than we initially realized. Dr. Chen listened intently as Margaret related her research findings. As a man of science, he was naturally skeptical of explanations that ventured into the paranormal. Yet, he couldn't deny what his own restoration work had revealed, a figure that seemed to exist in the photograph despite belonging to a different era. Margaret, I've been thinking about this case constantly since we spoke, Dr. Chen admitted. I've examined the technical aspects of the photograph dozens of times, looking for any explanation for what we're seeing. The film grain, the lighting, the focus, everything about this image is consistent with a single exposure taken in 1909. Whatever that figure is, it was there when the shutter clicked. Margaret felt a chill despite the warmth of her office. So, you don't think it's a double exposure or some other photographic anomaly? I've considered every technical possibility, Dr. Chen replied. Double exposures leave distinctive patterns that I'm not seeing here. Digital manipulation is impossible. This is clearly an authentic period photograph. Whatever we're looking at, it was captured by the camera exactly as it appears in the restored image. Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. James, I think we need to make this photograph public. If Timothy Whitmore's family still has descendants in the area, they deserve to know what we've found, and if there are other people who might have information about either Timothy's disappearance or Thomas Hartwell's death, this image might encourage them to come forward. Dr. Chen agreed, though with considerable reluctance. I'll prepare a detailed technical report documenting the restoration process and confirming the authenticity of the image. But Margaret, once this goes public, there's no controlling how people will interpret what we've found. 2 weeks later, the Salem Historical Society held a press conference to unveil the restored photograph and share the preliminary results of Margaret's research. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Local newspapers picked up the story, and within days, national media outlets were reporting on the mysterious photograph that seemed to show a connection between two tragedies separated by more than 3 decades. The publicity brought forward several individuals with additional pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Ella Lanina Hartwell Jameson, the great-niece of Thomas Hartwell's widow, contacted Margaret with a collection of family letters that provided new insights into Thomas Hartwell's death and his widow's subsequent struggle for justice. My great-aunt never stopped believing that Thomas was murdered, Mrs. Jameson told Margaret during their meeting at the Historical Society. She kept all of his papers, all of her correspondence with lawyers and investigators. She was convinced that the Whitmore family had orchestrated his death to silence his organizing efforts. The letters, yellowed with age, but still legible, painted a picture of a man driven by a passionate commitment to worker safety and a woman determined to see justice done for her husband's death. Thomas Hartwell had been documenting unsafe conditions at the mill, compiling evidence of management's deliberate negligence. According to his widow's letters, he had been scheduled to present his findings to a Labor Safety Commission just 3 days after his fatal accident. Most chilling of all was a letter dated October 1878, just 1 month after Thomas's death. In it, Mrs. Hartwell described a series of disturbing dreams in which her husband appeared to her, reaching out desperately and repeating the same phrase, "The boy, I must warn the boy." Mrs. Jameson had brought additional family photographs, including a formal portrait of Thomas Hartwell taken just months before his death. The resemblance to the reaching figure in the 1909 photograph was unmistakable. The same hollow cheeks, the same intense eyes, the same desperate expression. My great-aunt always said that Thomas couldn't rest while the Whitmore family continued to profit from the conditions that killed him. Mrs. Jameson explained she believed he was trying to communicate something important, but she never understood what he meant about the boy until she read about Timothy Whitmore's disappearance in the newspapers. Margaret realized that Mrs. Hartwell had made the same connections decades earlier, but without the photograph as evidence, her claims had been dismissed as the desperate fantasies of a grieving widow. The media attention also brought forward members of the Whitmore family, including Dr. Zara Whitmore Chen, Timothy's great-grandniece and a retired professor of American history. Dr. Whitmore Chen had spent years researching her family's history, and she possessed documents and photographs that filled in crucial gaps in the story. Timothy's disappearance destroyed my great-great-grandfather, Dr. Whitmore Chen told Margaret during their emotional meeting. Charles Whitmore never recovered from the loss of his son. He closed the mill within a year and spent the rest of his life searching for answers about what happened to Timothy. Dr. Whitmore Chen had brought Timothy's diary, a leather-bound journal that the boy had been keeping in the months before his disappearance. The entries revealed a child plagued by nightmares and strange visions, particularly in the weeks leading up to his vanishing. One entry dated just 5 days before Timothy's disappearance was particularly disturbing. "The man came again last night. He stands by my window and reaches for me, but he can't come inside. He keeps saying something about danger, but I can't understand the words. Mother says it's just dreams, but he seems so real. He looks so sad, like he wants to help me, but can't." Another entry from the day before Timothy disappeared was even more chilling. "I saw the man again today, but this time he was outside during the day. He was standing by the fence on Federal Street, and when he saw me, he started waving. I think he wants me to come to him tomorrow. I'm going to see what he wants. Maybe then he'll stop visiting my dreams." The diary entries suggested that Timothy had been experiencing supernatural encounters for weeks before his disappearance. Encounters with a figure that matched Thomas Hartwell's description. But rather than being threatened by this presence, the boy seemed to view it as benevolent, perhaps even protective. Dr. Whitmore Chen also provided copies of the police reports from Timothy's disappearance, including witness statements that hadn't been published in the newspapers. Several witnesses had reported seeing Timothy near the Federal Street fence on the morning he vanished, apparently engaged in animated conversation with someone they couldn't see. One witness, an elderly woman named Mrs. Catherine Morrison, had provided a particularly detailed statement. The boy seemed so happy, like he was talking to a dear friend. He was nodding and smiling, and then he started walking toward the old mill district. I called out to him, but he didn't seem to hear me. It was as if he was in a trance, following someone invisible. The police had also interviewed Charles Whitmore extensively about his son's disappearance. In his statement, the grieving father had mentioned something that now took on new significance. Timothy had been having nightmares about the mill for weeks. He kept talking about a man who wanted to show him something important. I thought it was just childish imagination, perhaps influenced by the stories workers sometimes told about the old days at the mill. As Margaret and Dr. Chen pieced together the evidence, a disturbing narrative began to emerge. Thomas Hartwell, killed while trying to expose dangerous conditions at the Whitmore Mill, appeared to have made contact with Timothy Whitmore 31 years later. The encounters, initially taking the form of dreams and visions, had eventually culminated in the boy's physical disappearance. But was this a case of supernatural intervention, or was there a more earthly explanation? Margaret decided to investigate the specific circumstances of Timothy's disappearance more thoroughly, focusing on the physical evidence that had been overlooked or dismissed by investigators in 1909. Working with Dr. Chen, Margaret arranged to have the restored photograph examined by forensic specialists at the Massachusetts State Police Laboratory. Using modern digital analysis techniques, they hoped to extract additional information about the mysterious reaching figure and the circumstances surrounding the photograph's creation. The forensic analysis revealed several disturbing details that hadn't been apparent even in Dr. Chen's careful restoration. Advanced enhancement of the reaching figure showed that the man's clothing was indeed from an earlier era, but more importantly, it revealed signs of what appeared to be severe physical trauma. The figure's torso showed dark stains consistent with dried blood, and his left arm appeared to be positioned at an unnatural angle, as if it had been crushed or broken. Even more unsettling was the analysis of the boy's expression and body language. While the wave had initially appeared cheerful and innocent, enhanced examination revealed subtle signs of distress. Timothy's eyes showed the dilated pupils consistent with fear or shock, and his free hand was clenched into a tight fist, a defensive posture that contradicted the apparent friendliness of his wave. The forensic team also made a discovery that changed the entire context of the photograph. Using spectral analysis to examine different layers of the image, they identified what appeared to be a second figure in the background, a shadowy presence that seemed to be observing the interaction between Timothy and the reaching man. This second figure was almost completely obscured by damage and age, but enhanced processing revealed enough detail to suggest an adult male wearing clothing consistent with the 1909 time period. Unlike the reaching figure, this observer appeared to be from the same era as the rest of the photograph. His positioning suggested that he was deliberately concealing himself, watching the scene unfold from a hidden vantage point. The implications were staggering. If the forensic analysis was correct, the photograph captured not just Timothy's final moments, but also evidence of someone else who had been present during his disappearance. Someone who had remained hidden from other witnesses. Margaret immediately contacted the Salem Police Department to share the forensic findings. While Timothy's disappearance was more than a century old, the new evidence suggested that his case might have been a homicide rather than a mysterious vanishing. If descendants of potential suspects were still alive, there might be a possibility of finally solving one of Salem's oldest cold cases. Detective Lieutenant Michael Torres, a specialist in cold cases and historical crimes, agreed to review the evidence. "Miss Wheeler, I have to admit that this is the most unusual case I've ever encountered," he said after examining the forensic reports and historical documents. "The evidence you've compiled is compelling, but it raises as many questions as it answers. Detective Torres brought a fresh perspective to the investigation, focusing on the practical aspects of Timothy's disappearance rather than the supernatural implications of the reaching figure. Let's assume for the moment that what we're seeing in this photograph is some kind of elaborate hoax or misinterpretation, he suggested. What would that tell us about the actual circumstances of the boy's disappearance? Working together, Margaret and Detective Torres developed a new theory about Timothy's fate. If the reaching figure was somehow explainable through conventional means, perhaps a double exposure, a deliberate photographic manipulation, or even a living person wearing period costume, then the focus should shift to the hidden observer in the background. This figure, unlike the anachronistic reaching man, clearly belonged to the same time period as the photograph. His concealed position suggested premeditation and possibly criminal intent. If Timothy had indeed been lured away from safety by someone posing as a supernatural figure, then the hidden observer might have been an accomplice or the actual perpetrator. Detective Torres began investigating the social and economic context of Salem in 1909, looking for individuals who might have had motives to harm the Whitmore family or profit from Timothy's disappearance. The research revealed a complex web of business rivalries, labor disputes, and personal grudges that surrounded Charles Whitmore and his industrial empire. Several potential suspects emerged from the historical record. Marcus Brennan, a former mill supervisor who had been fired by Charles Whitmore for suspected embezzlement, had been seen in Salem during the weeks preceding Timothy's disappearance. Brennan had publicly blamed the Whitmore family for his financial ruin and had made several threatening statements about getting revenge. Another suspect was Dr. Edmund Blackwood, a physician who had been involved in treating injured mill workers. Dr. B. Blackwood had accused Charles Whitmore of deliberately concealing the extent of workplace injuries and had been engaged in a bitter legal battle with the mill owner over compensation for disabled workers. The doctor had also been known to use photography as a hobby, which might explain the sophisticated staging of the mysterious photograph. But it was the third suspect who provided the most chilling connection to the photograph's supernatural elements. Professor Harold Grimby, a lecturer in psychology and spiritualism at a local college, had been conducting experiments in what he called psychic photography, attempts to capture supernatural phenomena on film through various manipulative techniques. Professor Grimby had approached Charles Whitmore several months before Timothy's disappearance, offering to investigate reports of strange occurrences at the former mill site. When Whitmore had rejected his services, Grimby had become increasingly obsessed with proving the existence of supernatural forces connected to the mill's tragic history. Detective Torres discovered that Professor Grimby had been in Salem on the day of Timothy's disappearance, conducting what he called spiritual investigations in the Federal Street area. More significantly, Grimby's personal notes preserved in the college archives contained detailed references to Thomas Hartwell's death and theories about how the mill worker spirit might be attempting to communicate with the living. The professor's notes also contained sketches and photographs that bore a striking resemblance to the restored 1909 image. Grimby appeared to have been experimenting with techniques for creating spirit photographs, images that appeared to show supernatural figures interacting with living subjects. "I think we may have found our answer," Detective Torres told Margaret as they reviewed Grimby's archive materials. This professor had the means, motive, and opportunity to stage the entire incident. He could have used his photographic expertise to create the supernatural elements in the picture, then lured Timothy away while the boy was distracted by what he believed was a ghostly encounter. The theory was compelling, but it raised new questions about Timothy's ultimate fate. If Professor Grimby had indeed orchestrated the boy's disappearance as part of some twisted experiment or revenge scheme, what had happened to Timothy afterward? Had he been killed immediately, or had he been held somewhere against his will? Margaret and Detective Torres decided to investigate Grimby's known associates and properties from 1909, hoping to find clues about where Timothy might have been taken. The research revealed that the professor had maintained a private laboratory in an isolated farmhouse about 10 miles outside Salem. The property had been used for his photographic experiments and what he called psychic research. Current property records showed that the farmhouse still existed, though it had changed hands multiple times since Grimby's death in 1923. The current owners, a young couple who had purchased the property as a fixer-upper, agreed to allow Margaret and Detective Torres to examine the premises. The farmhouse was a grim, weather-beaten structure that seemed to emanate an aura of neglect and decay. The current owners explained that they had discovered several unusual features during their renovation work, including a hidden room in the basement that appeared to have been used as a dark room for photographic processing. More disturbing still was the discovery of children's belongings scattered throughout the hidden room, a few pieces of rotted clothing, some broken toys, and scratch markings on the walls that suggested the presence of a young occupant. Carbon dating of the materials confirmed that they were from the early 20th century, but it was the final discovery that provided the most conclusive evidence of Timothy's fate. Behind a false wall in the basement, Detective Torres found a small collection of personal items wrapped in oiled cloth, a pocket watch engraved with the initials TWW, a child's leather shoe, and a fragment of fabric that matched the clothing Timothy had been wearing on the day of his disappearance. The evidence strongly suggested that Timothy Whitmore had been brought to Professor Grimby's farmhouse after his disappearance from Federal Street. Whether the boy had died there immediately or had been held for some time remained unclear, but his fate was no longer a mystery. Margaret felt a profound sadness as she stood in the basement, where a young boy's life had likely ended more than a century earlier. The photograph that had started as a simple restoration project had led them to solve one of Salem's oldest cold cases, but the solution brought little comfort to anyone involved. "At least his family can have some closure," Detective Torres said quietly as they prepared to leave the farmhouse. "Timothy's descendants deserve to know what happened to their ancestor, even if the truth is difficult to accept." The case officially remained open due to the age of the crime and the death of all potential suspects, but the Salem Police Department issued a statement acknowledging that new evidence had shed light on Timothy Whitmore's 1909 disappearance. The statement carefully avoided speculation about the supernatural elements of the case, focusing instead on the probable involvement of Professor Harold Grimby in what appeared to be a kidnapping and murder. For Margaret, the resolution of Timothy's case brought a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The restoration of a single photograph had uncovered a century-old crime and provided answers to questions that had haunted two families across multiple generations. Yet, the image itself remained troubling, its supernatural elements unexplained, despite the earthly resolution to the mystery. Dr. Chen shared Margaret's ambivalent feelings about their discovery. "We may have solved the crime," he told her during one of their final conversations about the case, "but we still don't have a complete explanation for what the camera actually captured that day. The reaching figure, the anachronistic clothing, the apparent interaction between Timothy and someone from a different era. These elements remain as mysterious as ever." Margaret nodded, understanding his frustration. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved completely. Maybe the important thing is that we were able to bring some measure of justice to Timothy's memory and peace to his descendants. The restored photograph was eventually put on permanent display at the Salem Historical Society, accompanied by a detailed explanation of the investigation it had sparked. Visitors often stood before the image for long minutes, studying the boy's wave and the mysterious reaching figure, each drawing their own conclusions about what they were seeing. Some visitors dismissed the supernatural elements as photographic artifacts or deliberate manipulation. Others remained convinced that the image had captured something beyond the realm of normal experience. But regardless of their interpretation, all who viewed the photograph seemed to share a common reaction, a sense of profound sadness for the young life that had been lost and the families that had been forever changed by his disappearance. Margaret often found herself standing before the display in the quiet hours after the museum had closed, reflecting on the strange journey that had begun with a simple restoration request. The photograph had taught her that the past was never truly past, that the echoes of historical events could reach across decades too.